Have you ever felt strangely unsettled after listening to someone else's traumatic story? Maybe you became extra jumpy walking alone at night after hearing your friend's mugging story. Or you had vivid nightmares featuring car crashes you never experienced, only heard about from a colleague. If so, you may be experiencing secondary trauma without even realizing it. Secondary trauma, also called vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue, can sneak up on you. It refers to the changes that can occur when you are repeatedly exposed to other people's traumatic experiences secondhand. Secondary trauma can leave you feeling anxious, overwhelmed, even physically unwell. And you may not connect these changes to being exposed to another person's pain, but make no mistake. Living through others' trauma, even indirectly, takes a toll on your mental health. Here are the top 6 signs that it's not general stress or worrying. It's secondary trauma. Sign 1. Emotional exhaustion. Ever wring out a sponge until it's bone dry? That's what hearing about trauma over and over can do to your emotions. You feel like you have zero capacity left to absorb anyone else's pain. Your empathy bank account has been drained. You're running on emotional fumes. So you start avoiding conversations involving trauma. You visibly cringe or change the subject when someone brings up their distressing story. Not because you don't care, but because you're desperately protecting the last few drops of your emotional reserves. This emotional exhaustion is one of the hallmark signs of secondary trauma. The nonstop exposure to others' pain quite literally depletes your ability to feel their suffering. Your natural empathy gets worn down when it's constantly bombarded with traumatic details. At first, you may have felt honored that people trusted you enough to open up about difficult experiences. You listened with care, wanting to be supportive and compassionate without judgment. But over time, hearing story after story of trauma took its toll. Your shoulders felt heavier each time someone disclosed abuse, grief, violence. Their pain started seeping into you, weighing on your spirit. In self-protection mode, your psyche throws up a shield. Their trauma still tugs at your heartstrings, but that pull feels muted now. Your eyes glaze over instead of welling up with tears. This numbness allows you to function without being emotionally crippled by distress that isn't yours, but it takes a toll in other ways. You used to freely hug your friends and family, exuding warmth. Now you tense up when people get close, avoiding emotional intimacy. Laughing comes less easily when you carry others' burdens. Coping mechanisms like gallows humor creep in too. You make inappropriate jokes about trauma, attempting to distance yourself from the unbearable sadness, but this often pushes away loved ones who need you. Withdrawal takes hold as your psyche desperately tries to conserve what little emotional energy you have left. You isolate yourself more, disconnected and irritable from the cumulative grief that doesn't belong to you directly. This deadening of natural empathy is often necessary to prevent complete burnout, but it masks a deeper need for replenishment and professional support. Left unaddressed, the numbness can become permanent, leaving you unable to meaningfully connect with anyone. Secondary traumatic stress corrodes your very capacity for compassion. That's why healing must include resetting boundaries and limits, checking in with yourself about when enough is enough, asking for help when vicarious grief becomes too heavy. With care, the well of empathy can gradually be restored. Feelings flow more freely again and your laugh returns, but avoiding overload is key to preventing repeat emotional drought. It's a delicate balance, giving support without taking on the trauma as your own. With healthy coping skills, you can be present for others' pain without being consumed by it. Your huge heart is still there, just covered for its own preservation after absorbing blow after blow. Have patience with yourself, and trust that, in time, feeling will seep back as you process the traumatic stories you've heard. For now, listen to your exhaustion. It's asking you to take a step back and make space for lightness. The greatest gift you can offer those who are hurting is your whole, healthy self, full to the brim with compassion, yet not overflowing with their grief. Sign 2. Nightmares. Out of the blue, your sleep is disrupted by vivid nightmares of car wrecks, assaults, natural disasters. They leave you shaking, heart pounding. But in the light of day, you realize these terrifying dreams bear no relation to your actual life. You've never experienced the traumatic events you're now reliving each night. So where do they come from? Secondary trauma. Your brain is processing the traumatic stories it's absorbed from others, and those frightening images are bleeding into your subconscious mind. Repeated nightmares related to trauma you didn't go through firsthand are a hallmark of secondary trauma. Your brain's fear center, the amygdala, can't tell the difference between direct and indirect trauma, so it sounds the alarm, even while you sleep. Sign 3. Bystander guilt. When you hear about a mass shooting, sexual assault, or fatal car accident, do you secretly think I should have done something? You feel ashamed, guilty, or doubtful of yourself for reasons that don't quite make sense. After all, how could you have prevented a trauma you weren't even present for? But rational thoughts don't stand a chance against misplaced bystander guilt, a classic secondary trauma response. Deep down, you irrationally overestimate how much responsibility you bear for being unable to intervene in someone else's tragedy, even though realistically, there's nothing you could have done to change the outcome. This false sense of guilt stems from wishing you could have somehow stepped in and stopped the suffering. It's evidence your empathy and moral compass are still intact, but that you need support processing these painful emotions. Sign 4. Emotional shutdown. At first, you eagerly listened with compassion as your friend opened up about childhood abuse. You were glad she trusted you enough to be vulnerable. But after weeks of emotional conversations, something changed. You start avoiding her calls, changing the subject away from the trauma. And inside, you feel strangely numb whenever she does bring it up. This emotional shutdown is a tactic used to cope with secondary trauma. After an overwhelming amount of pain by proxy, your psyche flips a switch. Stories that once evoked empathy and sadness now barely register. It's your mind's way of protecting itself from additional distress when its emotional resources are depleted. But being numb to others' suffering can be troubling and alienating. Unfortunately, the numbness often spills over into loved ones too. You may notice yourself feeling detached, even callous towards friends and family, ignoring their needs. But take heart, this lack of emotion signals you need a break and professional support, not that you're a bad friend. With self-care and set boundaries, your compassion can reignite. Sign 5. Hypervigilance. Walking alone at night, you clutch your keys like a weapon, heart racing for no reason. At the mall, you scope out emergency exits, suspiciously eyeing anyone who passes. Previously, mundane situations now seem brimming with hidden threats. You become hypervigilant about harm and obsessed with the safety of your loved ones. Through the lens of secondary trauma, the world looks like a much darker, riskier place. Your fight or flight switch has been flipped to on by constant immersion in others' pain. Seeing danger everywhere disrupts your ability to feel safe and secure. It stems from your nervous system and amygdala being stuck in high alert mode from secondary trauma. You may find yourself feeling anxious doing routine activities like grocery shopping, becoming extremely overprotective of your kids, or avoiding going out after dark entirely. This excessive fear response can be exhausting and isolating, but inner peace is possible by addressing the root cause, the secondary trauma distorting your perception. Sign 6. Irritability. After a long day, your partner forgets to take out the trash again. In the past, you'd calmly remind them, but this time you absolutely lose it. Yelling, crying, you slam doors and spew hurtful words over an issue that normally wouldn't warrant such a reaction. Inside, your emotions feel raw and on edge. What gives? This intense irritability is a side effect of secondary trauma. Hearing about one tragedy after another wears down your ability to manage distress. So you blow up over minor frustrations at home. The cumulative emotional weight of bearing witness to trauma lowers your threshold for getting triggered. Small things set you off because your nervous system is already in a state of hyperarousal. Lashing out at loved ones doesn't make you a bad person. It's simply a sign you feel overwhelmed and need support. With professional help and self-care, you can recover perspective and restore inner calm. The key is recognizing that it's not everyday stress behind your changes in behavior, mood, and mindset. It's the undercover effects of bearing witness to trauma, secondhand. Don't hesitate to reach out for specialized counseling focused on trauma healing. You deserve to feel like yourself again, unburdened from carrying others' pain.